Now, of all the gospel harmonies that I have access to, there were only two that think there should not be a combination between Luke, Matthew, and Mark. These gospel harmonies see that Luke should remain separate as it's recorded at a later time, and that would include the Chronological Gospels by Michael Rood and the Gospel in Life by A.T. Robertson. They leave the harmony with a repeat of this man being healed, the accusation of using the power of Beelzebub, Satan, to cast out demons, Jesus' response to the parable, divided houses cannot stand, Satan against Satan, the demand for a sign, and then Jesus giving them the sign of Jonah. They leave those repeated. One reason that I can see why it might actually need to be repeated is because the man healed in Matthew is mentioned to be blind and dumb or mute. Luke only says he's mute. Luke doesn't say he's blind. But that's not actually a big deal. There are plenty of times where a gospel writer will leave out some information. Matthew often includes more information than the others, like with the Gadarene demoniac, although Matthew labels it Gerasene demoniac, that there were two demon-possessed men instead of just one. Mark and Luke mention the one, but not the two. So for Matthew to include a little bit more information about these spiritually plagued people, it's not that strange. There's another small reason why I might side with Luke as the location of where these events should be combined. The order of these events is a bit more strange, meaning, as it follows in Luke, the man was healed so that he could speak. He was accused of using the power of Beelzebub, but then the people, immediately after accusing him, follow with a demand for a sign. Jesus answers the first accusation by explaining the parable, divided houses cannot stand. Then a random woman yells out a blessing to the womb that bore him. Then Jesus answers the second demand. Jesus answered the first statement of the accusation by explaining with the parable of how divided kingdoms cannot stand. A woman shouts out a blessing to the womb that bore him. Then Jesus continues answering the second statement, which was the demand for a sign. He gives the sign of Jonah. That order of events, it's kind of like statement 1, statement 2 by the people. Then Jesus gives answer 1, answer 2, is a little bit more difficult to follow along with than the way Matthew has it, where he explains the man was healed who was blind and dumb. He's accused of using the power of Beelzebub or Satan. Jesus then immediately answers that accusation by giving the parable how divided houses cannot stand. Then they demand a sign from him, and he gives them the sign of Jonah. So in Matthew, it's more like statement 1, answer 1, then statement 2, answer 2. And that's a bit easier to follow for the reader than it goes in Luke. I haven't shown this point yet, but Matthew does a similar thing when it comes to the parable of the sower and the parable of the wheat and the tares. Jesus was in a boat speaking to a crowd, giving multiple parables, and then he came in and gave a private explanation to the disciples. But Matthew explains that he gave the parable of the sower, then gave the private explanation, followed with the parable of the wheat and tares, then the private explanation of that, which couldn't actually have happened because he was in a boat talking to a crowd. He must have given the parables first, then the explanation. So Matthew did move things to make it easier for the reader. I can understand how he may have done that here as well. Reorganize these events so that they are easier for the reader. That's kind of a minority text critical reading, where because something is a bit more difficult to understand, it might actually be accurate. Any changes made by authors would be to make things easier to understand, not more difficult. So Luke may actually have the more correct version, since it's a bit more difficult to follow. It's a bit weak of an argument, so I'll kind of leave that off to the side. Also, the idea that Luke is usually in order of event is countered by the fact that Mark is also usually in order of event. Mark does move the prophecy being fulfilled of John the Baptist earlier, whereas Luke and Matthew have Jesus speaking that prophecy being fulfilled later on. But also, Luke has Jesus' family coming to meet him, his mother and his brothers, after the parable of the sower, whereas Matthew and Mark have it before. So Luke most likely moved that one as well. Both Mark and Luke are usually in chronological order, but sometimes they move things, so I'll have to leave that reason to the side as well. The only other bit of evidence I have to show where these events should go is the majority witness of Matthew and Mark having it in the same place, and Luke having it in a different place. I could leave them separate, I could have them repeat, but that kind of goes against the entire purpose of this project. It's to avoid the repeats and put the events where they most likely happened, which I'm going to go with Matthew and Mark. So I definitely feel comfortable putting it back where it was written in Matthew. Although, where it starts in verse 33, that might have to be separated. Because what he says here is, no man, when he has lighted a candle, puts it in a secret place, neither under a bushel, but on a candlestick, that they which come in may see the light. The light of the body is the eye. Here's the problem. That is earlier in Luke. So this would be the second time it's actually written here in Luke. Luke 8, after he gives the parable of the sower, after he says, to you it is given to know the mysteries, he's explaining in verse 10. Verse 16, no man, when he has lighted a candle, covers it with a vessel or puts it under a bed, but sets it on a candlestick, that they which enter in may see the light. For nothing is secret that shall be made manifest, nor anything hidden that shall not be known come abroad. So he does repeat this in Luke. However, he doesn't say it in Matthew. He's talking about an evil and adulterous generation. After a question, the sign of the prophet Jonah. Speaking about Nineveh, the queen of the south, unclean spirits going out, bringing 7 more in if you do not keep it protected. And then he stops. While he had talked to the people, his mother and his brethren stood outside. And he says, who is my mother? Who are my brethren? No mention of lighting a candle here. Not throughout all the rest of the explanation of his parables, even in chapter 13. Let's take a look at Mark. In Mark, it's pretty short. How can Satan cast out Satan? And if a kingdom be divided against itself, how can it stand? He talks about blasphemy against the Holy Ghost. He talks about his mother and his brethren coming to him. Then the parable of the sower. Here in Mark, it actually does mention the candle. Is a candle brought to be put under a bushel or under a bed, and not to set on a candlestick? For there is nothing hidden which shall not be manifested, neither was anything kept secret, but it should come abroad. So, until verse 33, at least until then, all these verses from chapter 11, Luke 11:14 to 32, I'm going to put over to this earlier passage mentioned in Mark and Matthew, where he's casting out the dumb spirit and accused of using the power of Satan.